All right, so language arts today, we're going to start getting into content. And what we're starting off with is talking about the parts of a narrative. And so a narrative is a fancy way to say the word story. All stories, if they're good stories, have the same parts. They follow what's called a plot. A plot is basically, think of a map of like, where's the story going to take me, right? A beginning, a middle, and an end should be parts of the story. We're going to give it some more complicated terms than that. But you should be able to name the parts of a plot. There are five. So that's one of your learning targets for today. And then you should be able to not only name those, be able to identify those parts of a plot in a short movie clip. So that is what we're starting off with. So as a warm up, we're going to watch this video together, and this is going to give you an overview of what we're going to talk about today. All right, and so that is the five parts of a plot. That's your basic introduction to
Created using Powtoon.
plot elements. So let's talk about it in a little bit more depth here. So a plot is a sequence of events that makes up. Let me go back in there. That makes up a story. There are five parts to a plot, and it's always going to flow this way. This, if the story makes any kind of sense whatsoever, right? None of us would pay $20 to go sit in IMAX, and then they tell us the ending, and then say, "Hey, who wants to stick around for the movie?" Right? That would be ruined. It has to go in a certain flow, and it doesn't matter if it's a novel, if it's a Pixar short, if it's a movie, if it's a short story. Anything that is a narrative, that is a story, should have a plot. So a plot is a sequence of events that makes up the story, right? Think just the most basic thing you know: beginning, middle, and end. All right, so a plot, another thing you have to know is a plot has to have conflict. If there's no conflict, then it's just like a grocery store shopping list, right? If I said, well, here's my story. I went to breakfast, I ate some pancakes, I paid my bill, and I went home. It's not really a story, it's a summary, because there was no emotional reaction, it wasn't interesting. So stories need to have conflict, and we're going to talk about this a bunch this year. We're going to talk about all this a bunch this year. So first, it needs to have an internal conflict, or at least good stories have internal conflict. Internal means it's inside the mind. It occurs when a character struggles with his or her own needs, desires, or emotions. Okay, they think of a good way to think of internal conflict is should I, and then fill in the blank. Okay, should I run or should I fight? Should I help my friend or should I tell my parents the truth? Anytime the question is in their own mind and they're not sure what to do, it's a decision in their brain, it's an internal conflict. When you sit down at a restaurant and look at a menu, you have an internal conflict because you say, wow, I really want to get the fish and chips, but then I also really want a hamburger. That's an internal conflict because it's inside of you, right? Internal, inside. External conflict occurs when a character struggles with an outside force, such as another character or something in nature, could be a society, right? There's something outside of that character that's creating the problem, right? The menu, when I look at the menu, my mind is creating the problem because I don't know what to choose. But if I'm having an external conflict, it could be that I've lost my wallet and now I don't know how to pay for my food, right? Or typically in stories and narratives, an external conflict is between a protagonist and an antagonist, a hero and a villain, right? Batman versus the Joker. That's an external conflict because Batman is struggling against an outside force that's the Joker. So you need to know that a conflict is a problem, and there's two types, two places it can happen. It can happen in your brain. Should I? Should I do this? Should I do that? Or it can happen in the outside world, external, right? Which is going to be character versus character versus nature, or character versus society. Hunger Games is an example of character versus society, right? Katniss has to fight a society that's not fair. Character versus nature would be your survival stories where there might only be one character and he or she is the protagonist and they're out surviving on a deserted island in wilderness and nature and hurricanes and animals. That becomes the external conflict, just trying to survive. All right, exposition. So now we're actually getting into the learning targets, the 5 parts of a plot you need to know. The exposition always has to come at the start of the story. If it doesn't have an exposition, it makes no sense. It's the introduction of the story. It's got to tell you the setting, and setting is where and when a story takes place, right? Brentwood is not a setting. Brentwood is a place, but Brentwood in the year 2020 is a setting, okay? Your grandmother's house last Wednesday can be a setting. New York City in the year 1777 can be a setting. A setting must have a time and a place. Okay. In the exposition, they also introduce major characters. So if you think to Finding Nemo, right? In the beginning, we learn a whole ton. We learn what motivates Marlin. We learn that he had a wife named Coral. We understand why he has this relationship with Nemo. We learn about Nemo. However, in the exposition, we don't meet Dory, right? We don't meet Bruce the shark. They're just telling you the things you need to know about the most important characters of the story. Then at the end of the exposition comes the conflict. This is what we will also call the inciting incident. It's when the problem starts. So in Finding Nemo, when Nemo is taken, that starts the conflict. That starts the problem because now Marlin has something he needs to solve. He needs to find Nemo. It just gives you all the background you need to understand it. So going back to Finding Nemo, when Nemo's taken, it's a problem because Marlin, that's his only child, right? And he loves him a ton and he wants to get him back. And so when Nemo's taken, that's the end of the exposition. And then we're off and running into the next part of a plot. The next part of a plot is called the rising action. So these are major events that develop the plot and lead to the climax. The climax is also known as the turning point. It's the point of great suspense. So as we talk Finding Nemo, Nemo gets taken. That's the inciting incident. Then we're into rising action, the second part of the plot, right? And then Marlin swims and swims and swims. And one of the first things that happens is he meets Dory, right? And then he goes on this adventure and he continues to go on this adventure where, he has to overcome all these obstacles. We learn about Nemo being in the dentist office, trapped in the tank. That's all rising action. And it leads to what's the turning point, right? The big question we have is what's going to happen to Nemo? Is Nemo going to die? Is he going to get found? What's going to happen? That major showdown that we're working towards, that turning point, is the climax. So the climax is the event that is the turning point in the story at which the conflict could be resolved in different ways. So we know we've had this conflict that we're building up towards, right? So Batman is finally face to face with the Joker, and they're going to have that big fight scene. Well, that's the climax. Who's going to win, right? That's a pretty typical Marvel movie climax. Who's going to win the big fight, right? And Finding Nemo, okay, what do you think the climax might be? What's the point where there's kind of a turning point? Think of the point of just that's the most exciting. The simplest way I can say a climax in a story often is it's the point where you won't stop watching it. You're not going to go to get popcorn. You're not going to go use the bathroom. You need to be here for the next 10 seconds, 30 seconds, 2 minutes, because this is the important part. Something really important is about to happen here. That is a climactic scene, right? Suspenseful is another literary word we use, where there's a lot going on, and you want to know what's going to happen. Something important is going to happen here. It's exciting, it's suspenseful, it's tense. That's your climax in a plot. Now, once that happens, you're going to be left with some questions, right? So in Finding Nemo, the climax is the big scene with when Marlin shows up into the dentist office, and then Nemo, goes into the drain, and they have the whole big scene, and we have a lot of questions. Like, Marlin thinks Nemo's dead, and he's not going to find him, right? Because he sees Nemo in the bag upside down, and he doesn't know the whole backstory. And so in the Falling Action, the first time you ever see the movie, we have a lot of questions. Does Marlin give up? Do him and Nemo ever get reunited? Do they go home? Like, it's after the big fight scene between the Batman and the Joker or whatever. There are questions that you have where you say, well, what's going to happen next? Like, you didn't tell me about this part. Good stories and Falling Action will answer those questions, where they'll begin to tell you, hey, after the climax, I know you want to know about this, so here's a little bit of information about the things you're wondering about. So that's the fourth part of the plot, the Falling Action, which leads us into the resolution. This is just called the end. They conclude the story, and they often reveal a theme. A theme is a lesson that you learn about what you watched or what you read. So a theme in Finding Nemo, there's a whole bunch, and I'm hoping we'll get to talk about them. I'm not going to tell you, but there's a lot in big stories. The tortoise and the hare, right? That teaches a lesson. It's an Aesop's fable from ancient Greece, which we'll learn about this year. We'll talk about Aesop. But the lesson of the tortoise and the hare, right, is that you slow and steady wins the race. Don't give up, right? Another theme of that is don't be overconfident, right? Because the rabbit, the hare, is so overconfident that he's so fast, he takes it too easy and he loses, right? And so the theme is often revealed in the resolution. The resolution is just a fancy way to say the end. This is how it all gets wrapped up. Now, not all stories have a fulfilling resolution, right? So Marvel, at the end of their movies, sometimes they leave you ready to go watch another movie. Why do they do this? Well, the real reason in business is because they want your money. But for storytellers, it's because they want you to go read the third book or go watch the fifth movie or whatever. But a resolution should be a closure to the story. Now, for the birds, I'm going to just show this to you, and I'm not going to talk about it because you'll see it again in the Edpuzzle. But I want you on your own to try to think about this and just think like, okay, where does it feel like the climax is? If you can only identify one part of the story, try to identify the climax, because then it splits the story and the plot diagram into two parts. And then you can identify those two parts usually a lot easier. So just watch this and see if you can identify the climax of the story. right, now there is the end. What part of a plot would we call the end? Right? The fancy word is the resolution. So I just want you to take a second and pause and think, where was the climax in that right there? Where was a point of great suspense where you really just couldn't wait to see what happens next? So see if you can figure it out when we'll continue to talk about that. Now, here's again your part of a plot, right? Just as a visual. This is often how you'll see it displayed. Exposition. So in summary, in exposition, you're gonna learn the setting, when and where does the story take place, main characters that you need to know about to start the story. So when, okay, where, who. So, and we're going to need some traits too. That's a fancy word that we're going to talk about. But a trait is basically just a part of a character that describes who they are. And we're going to get into that. That's a huge part of narratives. But they wouldn't just say, oh, well, this is Joe and this is Samantha and that's Steve and that's Nemo. It doesn't tell us anything about them. Again, in Finding Nemo, the exposition, we learn what motivates Marlin. We learn why Nemo is so important. We learn about the setting and the coral reef and the ocean. And then at the end of the exposition, okay, you get the climax. Or, I'm sorry, not the climax. You get the inciting incident. This is the part that starts the story off. It's the conflict. Good stories have to have conflict. There has to be a problem. People love conflict in stories. We love mystery. We love things that need to be solved, stuff that needs to be figured out. So the conflict starts, and then you have the rising action, right? Where Marlin goes swimming after Nemo, and then he meets Dory, and then they have this adventure, and then they have this adventure, and then we learn about Nemo in the tank, and Nemo has this adventure, and they learn this lesson, and then it gets to that climax, okay? That point of greatest suspense, the big showdown, the turning point, right? The most exciting part of the movie often is the climax. It's the big battle scene, the car chase, whatever. It's the point of greatest suspense. It's the turning point. Then after that, we're going to still be left with some questions, right? Like, okay, I know that I saw the villain, fall off the building, but did they really die, or are they going to come back, right? Or I know that I saw in this case, okay, they survived the hurricane, but now they're still stuck on this island. So what happens? Are they going to find food now, or what happened to their shelter? You have questions that need to be answered, and that happens in the falling action, which leads ultimately towards the resolution. Right, so you get this question answered and this question answered. Then all of a sudden, the resolution, right, is that Nemo is back on the reef. And spoiler alert, although this movie's like 20 years old, so you should have watched it by now. But Nemo's back on the reef. He's learned a lesson, right? Marlin's learned a lesson. There's a theme involved. Like, it's the end. And those are the 5 parts of a plot. And they always go in this order. Exposition leads to the rising action, which will create a climax, which means we need falling action to come to a resolution. Those are the 5 parts of a plot. Now, again here, this is an interactive piece. So actually, we're not going to do this because you're going to be doing something else with it. But that's just another way you can see, right? What's the term here? Fill in the blank. Okay, what does that term mean? Exposition, start of a story, setting, conflict, characters. What's this one? What's this one? What is it? No, you have to say it. No, I'm not going to. You have to say it. No, I'm not going to do. No, you have to. It's the. Can't hear you. Are you ready, kids? It's the SpongeBob SquarePants. No, it's the rising action, right? It's the part of the story leading towards the climax. Think of this as kind of the adventure. Right, climax. You should know that one. I've talked about it a million times. It's the point of greatest suspense. It's the turning point. It's the big showdown. Then we have some, what? What's this one? What is this one called? The falling action, right? Where they're kind of working towards answering some unsaid things, tying up loose ends, which leads towards, we don't call it the end in narratives. It's the end, but we don't call it that. What do we call it? Did you say exposition? Did you? Because you shouldn't have, because that's the wrong answer. This is the resolution, right? It's the end. So that is what you need to know about narratives. That's the 5 parts of a plot. Now, we're going to go back and look at the Birds, the Pixar short, and actually break it down bit by bit for your assignment today. But this is what you need to know about a narrative. If we go back to slide 1 in our learning targets, can you name the parts of a plot? You should be able to. If not, rewatch this, rewind it. And could you identify the parts of a plot in a short movie clip? And that is the next part that we're going to work on. So that's the directions and the instruction for today. And then the next part is going to be completing a short ed puzzle, which is going to answer that question. See if you can identify the parts of plot in a short movie clip.